She crawled into a crack no wider than her shoulders. 40 feet in the cave opened into a room the size of a cathedral. The crack had always been there. It ran vertically through the limestone face of Ashen Ridge like a wound that had never healed. 3 feet tall, 18 inches wide, breathing a cold breath that smelled of wet mineral and deep time. Hunters passed it. Loggers passed it. Children threw stones into it and listened to them clatter down into a silence that never gave them back. Nobody ever crawled in. It was too narrow. It was too dark. It was too much like a mouth. Verity Aldous crawled in on the 11th of November, 1849. She was 37 years old, the youngest of 4 children, the only daughter, and she had been given nothing. This was not bitterness. It was not the wounded arithmetic of a woman counting what she felt she was owed. It was simply a fact recorded in plain ink in the Harlan County probate ledger for the estate of Obadiah Aldous, deceased October of that same year. The family land, 260 acres of mixed timber and pasture in the Kentucky hills south of the Cumberland Gap, had been divided among the 3 sons. To Verity, the youngest, the daughter Obadiah, had left the ridge parcel. 40 acres, being that portion of rocky and unsuitable ground lying east of the creek and south of the old survey line, together with whatever may be found thereon. Whatever may be found thereon. Her brothers had laughed at those words. They had stood on the porch of the farmhouse that was now divided among them and read the line aloud, and laughed because the ridge parcel was Ashen Ridge, a long, narrow spine of bare limestone that ran for half a mile above the creek valley, too steep to farm, too rocky to timber, too barren to graze. It had been in the family for 3 generations and had never returned a single dollar. And so the brothers assumed their father had written that strange phrase as a formality, or as a last quiet joke at the expense of the child he had never quite known what to do with. "You got the bones," said Calder, the eldest, standing where the porch boards met the morning light. He was 46, heavy and certain, a man who measured the world in acres and bushels and rarely found it wanting in his favor. Ashen Ridge, fitting for the runt of the litter. He did not look at her when he said it. That was the part that landed, not the word, the not looking. "Ain't even good bones," said Merrick, the second brother who had taken the timber rights in the sawmill. He turned the deed over in his hands, as if the worthlessness of the land might somehow be printed on the back. "Limestone. Can't build with it. Can't burn it. Can't eat it. Can't even sell it lest you find a fool." The third brother, Thaddeus, said nothing. Thaddeus was the quiet one, the one nearest to Verity in temperament, if never in warmth. He had received the south pasture and the livestock, and he stood now in the doorway with his arms folded and his eyes lowered to the worn wood of the threshold, unwilling to join the mockery and just as unwilling to stand against it. There was a kind of cowardice in that silence. There was also, Verity knew, a kind of grief. She took the deed from Merrick's hand. She folded it once along a crease that already existed, and she put it inside her coat against her chest, where it would stay warm. And then she walked down the porch steps and out across the yard, past the smokehouse and the dry well and the hickory tree her mother had planted the year before she died. And she did not look back at any of them. She had nowhere to go except the ridge. So she went to the ridge. She walked east from the farmhouse and crossed the creek on a fallen log gone silver with age, and she climbed the slope through a stand of tulip poplars whose leaves had turned the color of old gold in the late November light. The ground steepened. The soil thinned. The trees surrendered first to cedar scrub and then to bare rock. Pale gray limestone, fractured and weathered, blotched with lichen that was itself the color of bone. The ridgetop was a narrow shelf, perhaps 30 feet across at its widest, running north to south, with steep falls on either side. From up there, she could see the whole of the valley below. She could see the farmhouse where her brothers were, even now dividing the last of their father's tools. She could see the smoke from the chimney that was no longer hers. And beyond all of it, she could see the blue haze of the Cumberland Mountains receding fold upon fold into a distance that did not care whether she lived or died. She was alone. She had been alone for most of her life, in the particular way that an unmarried daughter is alone in a house full of brothers, present useful, expected and entirely peripheral, loved in theory, overlooked in fact. Her mother had died when Verity was 9, and after that the house had become a place of men and labor, and few words and a girl who preferred a book to a butter churn had been a thing the family did not know how to name. Her father had been a practical man who prized practical children, and Verity, who asked questions that had no use and noticed things that paid no wage, had simply never met the standard. She had taught herself instead, from borrowed books, from the lending shelf of a Presbyterian minister 3 towns over who had taken a strange pity on a girl with a hungry mind. She had assembled a haphazard, genuine, and altogether useless education. Natural history, the rudiments of chemistry, and above all, the new science of the earth itself. The reading of stone, the patient grammar of how the ground had come to be. It was the kind of knowledge that would have made her remarkable in a university lecture hall. In a Kentucky Hill family, it had only ever made her odd. And now she had 40 acres of rock, $11 in coin, a bedroll, a hatchet, a knife, a coil of rope, a tin lantern, and a sack holding 3 books. A water-stained volume of Lyell's Geology, a used copy of an American scientific journal whose pages she had read so many times, the corners had gone soft as cloth, and her mother's Bible, which she kept not for prayer, but because her mother's handwriting lived in the margins, and that handwriting was the closest thing to her mother's voice that remained anywhere in the world. She made her camp that first night in the lee of an outcrop that broke the wind. She built a small fire of cedar deadfall. She ate a handful of parched corn and sat looking at the stars, which were very bright and very far, and utterly without interest in the fact that Verity Aldous now owned 40 acres of nothing. In the morning she began to walk her land. It did not take long. The ridge was narrow, and 40 acres of narrow ridge cover a great deal of distance, and almost no ground a person can use. She walked the whole length of it in 2 hours, and she walked it the way she had taught herself to do everything, slowly, with her eyes naming what she saw. Exposed limestone in horizontal beds, heavily fractured. Sinkholes where the rock had dissolved beneath itself and quietly collapsed. Red cedar and a few stunted oaks and clumps of blue stem grass clinging to the shallow pockets of soil. No spring, no flat ground, no timber worth the swing of an axe. Her brothers had been right about one thing. By every ordinary measure, the land was useless. But Verity had never been ordinary. She had been observant. And what she observed walking that cold spine of stone were the cracks. The limestone was full of them, vertical fractures running through the rock at uneven spaces. Some thin as a hair, some wide enough to slide a hand into. Most were dry, empty, dead. They led nowhere. But a few of them, and here she stopped and went still and lifted her face. A few of them were breathing. She had read of this in Lyell, the phenomenon by which air moves in and out of underground hollows in answer to the changing pressure of the sky and the difference in temperature between the deep earth and the surface air. A crack that breathes is a crack that opens into a void. A void in limestone country can be a hand's-width pocket, or it can be something else. She found the largest of them on the eastern face near the middle of the ridge's length. a vertical fissure in a low bluff, 3 feet tall, roughly 18 inches wide. Just wide enough, she judged, for a person to enter sideways if that person were not large. Verity was not large. She was 5'6" and lean with narrow shoulders, and the kind of wiry strength her brothers had always mistaken for frailty. She knelt before the crack and held her open hand in front of it, and the cold air pressed against her palm, steady, patient, with a force that surprised her. She knew at once that this was no shallow pocket. The breath was too strong, too constant. It came from somewhere with room. The temperature of it, she put at perhaps 55 degrees warm against a November morning that hovered in the low 40s. The smell was clean, wet stone, a faint sharpness of mineral, no rot, no sulfur, good air, moving air, air that had been somewhere and was on its way somewhere else. She should have gone for help. A sensible person would have gone for help. But there was no help to go for. There was a valley full of people who thought her mad already, and 3 brothers who had not looked at her on the day they took everything. There was no one in the world whose business it was whether Verity Aldous lived or died on a ridge that nobody wanted. And so the only person she could turn to was the one already kneeling at the mouth of the rock. She lit the lantern. She took off her coat because 18 inches is 18 inches, and she would need every fraction of herself. She turned sideways, held the lantern out before her in her right hand, and she pushed into the crack. The first 10 feet were the worst part she had yet known of being alive. The limestone walls pressed her chest and her back at the same moment, and every breath became a deliberate act, an argument she had to win against the stone, a forcing of her ribs outward against rock that did not yield. The walls were rough, not sharp enough to cut, but abrasive, dragging at her shirt, and the skin beneath it with every inch she gained. She could not move her arms. She could not turn her head. She could see only what the lantern threw directly ahead of her. More crack, more stone, a narrowing that quickened her heart before it widened again barely just enough. She moved by sliding 1 foot forward, then shifting her hip, then her shoulder, then her foot again. It was not crawling. It was something slower and more terrible than crawling. It was being swallowed, a patient incremental consumption by stone that had all the time in the world and no reason to hurry. The cold air poured past her stronger now, and she followed it the way a drowning person follows a current, not trusting it, only obeying it because it was the one thing in that darkness that seemed to know where it was going. At 20 feet, the crack angled downward. The floor dropped half a foot, and her boots scraped over loose gravel that had collected there across centuries. No one had counted. The walls turned wet, not dripping, but slick with the cave's own breath turned to water. The lantern flame guttered in the moving air and held. At 30 feet, the crack closed to 14 inches. She stopped. Her ribs were caught. Her breath came shallow and fast and would not go deep no matter how she fought for it. And for the first time, the curiosity and the stubbornness drained out of her all at once and left behind a thing far older than either a pure animal terror of confinement, of being held, of dying upright in the dark between 2 walls of stone that would never know she had been there at all. The fear was enormous, and it filled the narrow space the way water fills a sinking vessel, leaving no room for anything else. And she understood with awful clarity that panic in this place would kill her, that if she thrashed, she would wedge, that if she wedged, she would stay. She closed her eyes. She breathed. She counted 10 breaths, each one a small private war fought against the stone that pressed her heart. She thought of her mother's hand on the page. She thought of the line in the will that her brothers had read aloud and laughed at, whatever may be found thereon. And then the fear passed. Or rather, she passed through it the way a person passes through a doorway out of one room and into another out of panic, and into a cold, clear calm that was the exact opposite of everything she had felt a moment before. She opened her eyes. She turned her chest a few degrees, found the angle the rock would allow, and she kept moving. At 35 feet, the crack began to widen. The walls fell back an inch, then two, then all at once a foot on either side, and she could move her arms, could turn her shoulders, could pull a breath all the way down to the bottom of her lungs. The floor leveled, then dropped again more steeply, a natural ramp descending into a darkness that her lantern no longer touched. At 40 feet, the crack ended. Verity Aldous lifted her lantern and looked into a room the size of a cathedral. The chamber was immense. The lantern light, which had been more than enough to show her every crystal of the crack, dissolved into the dark, like a single candle held up to a night sky. She could see the floor at her feet, smooth limestone pale as poured milk, sloping gently away from her. She could see the nearest wall, perhaps 20 feet to her left, rising straight up into black. But the far wall and the ceiling and the true measure of the place, these lay beyond her light, somewhere out in a vastness that pressed against her, not with the crushing weight of the crack, but with its perfect opposite, an openness so complete it made her dizzy. She put her free hand against the cold stone beside her to keep her feet. She called out, not a word, just a single sound forced up out of her chest. The echo came back 3 times, each one fainter and farther than the last, arriving from directions she could not fix. The chamber had depth. It had height. It had distances her voice could only hint at, and her lantern could not reach. She walked forward. The floor was strangely even, a natural pavement of water-smooth stone, dry and solid under her boots. Her footsteps rang with a resonance she had never heard from any room built by men, not sharp, not hollow, but deep and sustained, as though the stone itself were ringing in sympathy with her. After 30 paces, her light at last found the far side, and it was not a wall. It was a curtain, a great cascade of flowstone 30 feet high, pouring down out of the unseen ceiling in frozen ripples of cream and amber, and the palest rose translucent at its thinnest edges, so that the lantern's glow passed through it and seemed to burn inside the stone itself, as if there were a low fire trapped at the heart of the rock. She turned slowly, holding the lantern high, and the cathedral gave itself to her one fragment at a time. Stalactites hung from above. She could see their tips now catching the flame, some slender as icicles, some thick and blunt as the pillars of a church. Where they had met, the stalagmites rising to meet them across how many tens of thousands of years. She could not begin to count. They had joined into whole columns that ran from floor to ceiling. Along the walls, the limestone had been carved by patient water into shapes that stopped her breath. Draperies of stone hanging in folds, soft as cloth. Rimstone dams holding terraced pools of water so still and so clear. They threw the lantern light back up into the dark above. In one low alcove, a cluster of twisted formations curled in spirals and corkscrews that seemed to defy the pull of the earth, like coral grown in a place the sea had left 10 million years ago. The beauty of it was almost more than she could carry. Verity was not a woman given to large feelings. Her brothers would have called her cold, and the truth was only that she kept her heart deep the way the earth keeps its heat. But standing in the center of that chamber, in the small, trembling circle of her own light, surrounded by formations that had been growing in absolute darkness since before there were people anywhere on the continent, she felt something rise in her chest that she could not name and did not try to. Her eyes stung. She let them. She had been told her whole life that she had been given nothing. She stood now inside the something, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She sat down on a low stalagmite that some ancient flow of water had worn flat across its top, and she opened her notebook, and her hands were shaking not from cold, not from fear, but from the simple, overwhelming weight of what she had found. She wrote the date, the 12th of November, 1849. She wrote that she had entered the crack on the east face of Ashen Ridge, that the passage ran some 40 feet and was very narrow, that it opened into a chamber of extraordinary size. She estimated the dimensions as best she could in the dark, and the dark gave her back nothing certain. Temperature, she wrote, approximately 56 degrees. Air good. Floor dry and level. And then she paused, and after the pause she added one more line in a hand steadier than the rest. This is the most remarkable thing I have ever seen, and it is mine. She underlined the last word once. Then she sat for a long moment in the lantern light and let herself believe it. It was the underlining that undid her in the end. Because as she lowered the notebook and lifted the lantern again to fix the chamber in her mind, the light swung wide across the floor near the base of the great flowstone curtain. A part of the room she had not yet crossed, and it found something pale lying against the stone that was not stone. She went still. She rose. She crossed the floor slowly. Her own footsteps loud in her ears, and she knelt, and she lowered the lantern, and the light spread across what lay there. And Verity Aldous understood that she was not the first person to stand inside the something after all. It was a man, or it had been. He lay on his side, half curled the way a person lies down when they are very cold and very tired, and have decided to rest a moment before going on. The flesh was long gone. What remained was bone gone, the same pale color as the floor it rested on, so that for years it must have lain there, as part of the cave indistinguishable from it waiting in the dark. Beside the body, eaten through with rust, lay a surveyor's chain, the kind a man carries to measure ground. He means to own. And near the bones of one hand where it had fallen, or where it had been held to the very last, lay a brass compass, its face fogged with age, its case green with the slow work of the cave's wet breath. She did not scream. She had spent her whole life learning to keep her feelings deep, and the depth held her now. But she sat back on her heels, and her own breath came shallow, and the cold, clear calm that had carried her through the crack came back to her, and she made herself look. Because looking was the only thing she had ever truly been good at, and looking was the only thing left to do. A man had come here before her. A man with a chain, which meant a man who had come to measure, to claim. And the cave had let him in, and the cave had not let him out. And he had lain down at the foot of the most beautiful thing in the world. And the dark had kept him for years past, counting. She picked up the compass. She wiped its case against her sleeve and turned it toward the lantern. And she saw that there was an engraving on the back, worn but legible, the letters cut deep by some hand that had cared about the man who carried it. She tilted it to the light, and she read the name engraved there. It meant nothing to her. Not yet. She set it down with a care she could not have explained, as though the dead man might still object. And she made herself go back to work, because work had always been the thing that held the dark at bay. And there was a great deal of dark in that chamber now. It was on the second pass, searching the alcove near where the body lay, searching. She would later admit for some sign of who the man had been and how he had come to die there, that she found the box. It was tin, plain, sealed against the damp with a rim of wax gone hard as stone and tucked back into a natural shelf in the rock where no flowing water would ever reach it, set there on purpose by someone who had wanted it found and wanted it kept. The dust on it was old, but not ancient. Not the dust of the dead man. Newer than that. Recent enough that her hands began to shake again before she had even worked the lid free. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth against the wet, were two things: a folded map and a letter. She unfolded the map first because it was on top, and she held it to the lantern, and she felt the floor of the cathedral tilt beneath her, though she had not moved at all. It was a map of the cave. This cave. The chamber she sat in, drawn in careful pencil, with its dimensions estimated, with the passage behind the flowstone curtain marked with a second chamber. Sketched beyond it, and a notation in a small, precise hand that read, "Pool depth, unknown water pure." It was a map made by someone who had been here, someone who had walked these rooms with a lantern the way she had, and measured them and loved them enough to draw them, and the hand that had drawn it, she knew. She had spent her childhood watching it write out accounts and copy scripture and sign deeds. She had seen it in the margins of no book because her father had never been a man for margins, but she had seen it every working day of her life until the day they put him in the ground. It was her father's hand. She set down the map. She took up the letter, and by the light of her own small flame in the center of the cathedral, her father had given her. Verity Aldous read the words he had left for the only child he had trusted to find them. It was not a long letter. Obadiah Aldous had never been a man who used 3 words where one would carry the load. But every line of it landed in her chest like a stone dropped into the still pool of the second chamber, spreading rings that would not stop. He had found the cave 30 years before he wrote. As a young man hunting along the ridge, he had felt the breath of the crack, and being curious in a way he had spent his whole life afterward pretending not to be. He had gone in. He had seen what she had now seen, and he had told no one. Not his wife, not his sons, not the minister, not the assessor. No one, because he had understood even then that a thing this beautiful would not survive being wanted by the wrong men. Limestone could be quarried. A cave could be stripped, its formations broken off and sold by the wagon load, its silence blasted open for a road. He had seen it happen elsewhere. And so he had kept the ridge in the family across 3 generations and let everyone go on believing it was worthless because the only protection a thing like this had ever had was that nobody knew it was there, and he had given it to her. Not as a joke, not as an insult, not as the leavings of a will. He had written the strange phrase into the deed on purpose, together with whatever may be found thereon. He had given the ridge to Verity, the daughter. The rest of them overlooked the child who read the earth and asked the useless questions and noticed the things that paid no wage, because she was the only one of his children who would ever go into the dark to see what was there. The others would have sold the ridge for the price of a mule and never wondered. She would crawl into a crack no wider than her shoulders. He had known that about her. He had known it her whole life, and never said so in the way men of his time and his hills never said the things that mattered most, and had instead written them into a deed and trusted the dark to deliver them. There is one thing more you must know. The letter ended, and the hand here grew less steady, as though he had written this part last, and with reluctance. You are not the only one who learned the ridge held a secret. A man came asking years ago, a man who deals in stone and rails and other men's land. I sent him off with a lie. But he did not believe it, and I think he never stopped looking. If he or his ever come for the ridge, do not sell. Whatever they offer, do not sell. There is a man's bones in the great room to tell you what this place does to those who come to take instead of to see. Guard it, daughter. You are the narrow one. You always were. I am sorry it took me dying to give you anything worth having." Verity sat for a long time after that. The lantern burned low. The drip from the second chamber kept its slow ancient rhythm, a sound that had been falling drop by drop since before her father was born. Since before his father. Since before there had been a single Aldous anywhere in the world. The bones of the unknown man lay pale against the floor a few feet from her boots. And somewhere in the dark above her, the great columns rose from floor to ceiling, indifferent and patient and unspeakably old. She had been given nothing. She had been given everything. And she had been given a warning written in her dead father's hand that everything she had just inherited was already being hunted. She did not yet know the name. She would not understand it for 2 more days. But she folded the letter and the map back into the oilcloth, and she returned them to the tin box. And she carried the box and the brass compass out of the cathedral, with her back through the second chamber's reach, up the natural ramp and into the throat of the crack. The way out was no easier than the way in. The stone gripped her chest at 14 inches and made her fight for every breath. And she fought and she came through because she had been through it once now. And the body remembers what the mind has survived. She came out into the November dusk, filthy and scraped and trembling. And she stood on the cold ridge with the warm breath of the cave rising past her face like the exhalation of something asleep. And below her in the valley, the windows of the farmhouse that was no longer hers had begun to glow yellow against the falling dark. Her brothers were in there, eating supper, dividing what was left, believing every one of them that they had won the better part of their father's estate, and that the daughter had been handed 40 acres of rock to keep her quiet and out of the way. Verity looked at the lights for a while. Then she went back to her own small fire, and she did not tell them anything. She did not tell them for 3 weeks. She spent those weeks the way she had spent her whole life, alone and looking. She returned to the cathedral again and again, learning its rooms mapping where her father's map left off, finding the second chamber with its still pure pool. And beyond that, a low passage that led on a hands and knees crawl to a third room hung wall to wall with hollow tubes of calcite, thin as drinking straws. So fragile a hard breath would shatter them. So beautiful she moved among them with a reverence close to terror. She measured. She sketched. She wrote, filling page after page of the notebook in her small, precise hand. The same hand she realized one evening with a strange ache as the hand that had drawn the map. Her father's hand passed down to the one child who used it the way he had. She buried the bones. That was the first thing she did before any of the mapping, before anything. She could not bring a coffin through 18 inches of limestone, and she would not leave a man to lie forever as a piece of the cave floor. So she gathered him as gently as she could into a length of oilcloth, and she carried him out through the crack a few bones at a time, across the better part of a day, and she buried him on the ridgetop, where the morning sun fell first, and she set a slab of the ridge's own limestone at the head of the grave. She did not carve a name into it. She did not yet know the name. She carved only a date, the date she had found him, and left the rest of the stone blank the way the rest of his story was blank, waiting to be filled. And it was on the 29th of November, with the first hard snow threatening and a sky the color of pewter, that the rest of the story came up the ridge to find her. She heard the horse before she saw the man. A good horse, well shod, ridden by someone who had not climbed that slope to hunt or to gather wood. She set down the kindling she had been splitting, and she waited at the mouth of the crack where she had been careful, these 3 weeks, to keep her tools and her tracks. The rider came up out of the cedar scrub and reined in 20 feet off and looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and she knew before he had said a word that this was the man her father's letter had warned her about. There are men who deal in stone and rails and other men's land, and there is a way they sit a horse when they have come to take something. And Verity Aldous had been reading people as carefully as she read rock for 37 years. He was perhaps 50. Well-dressed for the hills, a city coat gone careful at the elbows, a face that had been handsome once and had hardened into something more useful. He smiled when he dismounted, and the smile was practiced and warm and went nowhere near his eyes. "Miss Aldous," he said. "Verity Aldous, if I have it right. The youngest, the one who got the ridge." "You have it right," she said. She did not return the smile. "My name is Silas Thorne." He let the name sit there a moment as though she ought to recognize it, and was unsurprised when she did not. "I represent certain interests in the limestone trade, lime building stone ballast for the rail lines they're laying down through the gap. I've recently come into the parcel adjoining yours, your brother Merrick's timber ground, the slope just south of here. Good limestone under all of it, and I find myself in the market for the rest of the ridge. It's not for sale. You haven't heard the figure. I don't need to hear the figure." He smiled again, and this time something flickered behind it, a quickness and interest sharper than money alone. He looked past her at the crack in the bluff, at the cold breath rising visibly from it in the freezing air, a faint plume curling up the rock like smoke, like steam, like the breath of a sleeping thing. And she watched his eyes move to it and stop. And she understood in the second before he spoke that he had known about the crack, before he ever rode up the ridge, that he had not come to buy 40 acres of worthless rock, that he had come for what was behind it. "They say," Silas Thorne said slowly, still looking at the crack, "that your father used to walk this ridge, years back. Used to come up here alone and stay half a day and never say what he was about." He turned his eyes back to her, and the warmth was gone out of them entirely now, and what was left was older than warmth and colder than the cave. "My father walked it too. Once. A surveyor, my father was. A measuring man. He came up here near 20 years ago to look at this very ridge, and he carried a brass compass that I gave him myself, and he went up onto Ashen Ridge one morning." Verity did not move. She felt the tin box where it sat hidden in the cave behind her. She felt the brass compass with its engraved name she had read by lantern light and not understood lying on the shelf beside it. And she felt the name arrive in her now all at once the way the fear had arrived in the crack filling the space and leaving room for nothing else. "And he never came down again," Silas Thorne finished. 20 years, Miss Aldous. 20 years I have wondered what is in this ridge that swallowed my father whole. And now an old man dies and leaves the rock to a daughter nobody wanted. And that daughter has been climbing up here every day for 3 weeks with a lantern and a notebook. He took one step closer, and the snow began to fall. The first flakes drifting down between them, settling on his good city coat, and on the cold stone and on the warm rising breath of the cave. "So I'll ask you plainly, and I'll only ask the once. What did your father find up here? And what exactly did you bury on that ridgetop with a fresh stone and no name?" The snow fell harder. The cave breathed. And 40 feet inside the rock in a darkness no one had ever measured, the cathedral waited older than the quarrel, older than the will, older than the bones of either of their fathers for whoever would prove narrow enough and brave enough to keep it. Verity. Aldous did not answer Silas Thorne's question. She had learned long ago that silence was a kind of land a person could hold, and she held it now standing at the mouth of the crack, with the snow gathering on her shoulders, and the cave breathing warm against her back. "I buried a stranger," she said at last, "a man whose bones were on my land. That's all I'll tell you, because that's all that's any of your concern. The ridge is mine. The deed is filed in Harlan County, and I have nothing to sell you. Everything is for sale, Miss Aldous." Thorne's voice stayed even, almost gentle, and that gentleness was worse than any threat. "It is only ever a question of the price and of how long a person can afford to refuse it. You are a woman alone on a barren ridge with $11 to her name and 3 brothers who would not cross the creek to bury you. I can be patient. Patience is the whole of my trade." He gathered his reins and swung up onto the horse and looked down at her through the falling snow. "Your father lied to my father, and my father died of it. I do not intend to die wondering. I will know what is in this ridge. The only choice you have is whether you are rich when I find out, or whether you are simply in the way." He rode down off the ridge into the white, and Verity stood until the sound of the horse was gone. And then she went into the crack sideways, breath by breath through the 14-inch throat that she now passed almost without fear. And she sat in the cathedral with the brass compass in her hands, and she turned it to the lantern and read again the name engraved on its worn green back. It was his father's name. The dead man on the floor had been Thorne's father. The bones she had buried under a blank stone had a son, and the son had come exactly as her own father's letter had warned her he would. She understood then that the warning had not been a guess. Obadiah Aldous had not been imagining a danger. He had been describing one he had already met, and had carried in silence to his grave, and had handed down to her along with the cave itself, as though the burden and the gift were the same thing, and could not be given apart. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the warmth of the deep earth, while the first true snow of winter buried the ridge above her, and she did the only thing she had ever truly known how to do. She thought. She looked at the problem the way she looked at stone, turning it, reading it, finding the grain along which it might be split. The cave was hers in the deed. But a deed was only paper, and paper could be argued, and a woman alone could be argued against more easily than a man. Thorne had money, and money bought lawyers, and money bought the patience to wait until a thing fell into your hand. He had already taken the south slope. He would take more. He would surround her foot by foot and acre by acre until the ridge was an island in his land, and then he would find his way to the question of what lay beneath it. And the law in Harlan County had never been built to protect a strange unmarried daughter against a man who dealt in rails. There was only one thing she had that Thorne did not. She had the truth of the cave. She had seen it. She had measured it. And she understood, sitting there in the dark, that the cave's only protection had once been secrecy. Her father had believed that. But that secrecy had failed. Thorne already knew. The secret was out. And a secret that is out cannot be put back. So if hiding the cave would no longer save it, then the only thing left was the opposite. To make it known, to make it loved, to make it so famous, so studied, so valued by so many people that no man could quarry it without the whole of the country turning to watch him do it. Her father had hidden the cave to keep it alive. She would have to do the reverse, and she would have to do it before Thorne's patience ran out. But she could not make the cave known to the world through an 18-inch crack. No professor would crawl it. No newspaper man would write of a wonder he could not reach. The crack had kept the cave safe, and the crack had also kept it a secret. And now the crack was the very thing standing in her way. So in the dead of the worst winter she had ever known, Verity Aldous began to dig. She had found it during her 3 weeks of mapping a sinkhole on the ridgetop, 30 feet east of the crack, choked with the soil and rotted wood and fallen stone of uncounted years. She had felt the draft rising through the debris faint, but unmistakable, the same warm breath as the crack. A chimney. A natural shaft in the rock dropping straight down into the cathedral. Blocked at the surface, but open below. If she could clear it, she could make a way into the cave that a person could climb. A way that a professor could climb. A way that would let the world in. The work was beyond anything her body had been built for, and she did it anyway. She lowered herself into the choked shaft on her rope and dug by hand and by lantern light, filling a bucket with frozen earth and broken stone, climbing out to haul it up and dump it, and going back down again hour after hour, day after day through December and into January. The shaft was cruel. Loose rock fell from the walls without warning, and twice she pressed herself flat against the side as stones the size of her head crashed past her into the dark below, and twice she climbed out, shaking, and sat in the snow until her hands were steady enough to go back down. She built a crib of interlocking logs to hold the walls, stacking them like the casing of a well, and the work of cutting and lowering the timbers nearly killed her more surely than the falling stone. She told no one. She wanted no one. But a fire on a ridge in winter cannot be hidden forever. And on a gray morning in late January, a trapper named Amos Tatum, following a deer trail along Ashen Ridge, saw smoke rising from a hole in the rock and a coil of rope and a woman's coat lying at the edge of a fissure. He called out. A voice answered from inside the earth. He asked who was there, and the voice said its name and said it lived there. And Amos Tatum did not go down. He went to town, and he told everyone he met that Obadiah Aldous's strange daughter had lost her mind entirely and was living inside Ashen Ridge like a snake in a crevice, digging at the ground with her bare hands and talking to the rock. The story spread the way such stories do, growing teeth with every telling. It reached the settlement, and the settlement was not kind. A woman alone was already a thing. The hills did not know how to forgive. A woman alone, unmarried at 37, who had refused good Christian offers in her youth because she would rather read, and who now lived in a hole in the ground and dug like an animal through the dead of winter. That was not eccentricity. That was a judgment on the family. That was something wrong, something that needed fixing or shunning, and the valley could not decide which. And the story reached Silas Thorne, who understood at once that it could be made into a weapon. He did not need to win the cave by purchase if he could win it by doubt. He began quietly to talk. To the men who mattered in Harlan County, the assessor, the county clerk, a circuit judge who passed through twice a year. He spoke with great reluctance as a concerned and reasonable man of poor Miss Aldous, who was clearly not in her right mind, who was living in a manner no sound person would choose, who could not be trusted to manage 40 acres, let alone to understand what she had been left, and who really, for her own protection and her family's good name, ought to have the property placed under the management of someone responsible. A male relative, perhaps, or a guardian appointed by the court. It was the kindest thing, Thorne said, his voice full of sorrow. The Christian thing. And of course, were the ridge to pass into responsible hands, he stood ready to make a generous offer that would see the poor woman comfortable for the rest of her days. It was a beautiful trap, and Verity, deep in the shaft, did not even know it had been set. She broke through to the cathedral in the second week of February. The last plug of debris gave way beneath her bucket, and a draft of warm cave air rushed up the shaft into her face. And below her, 25 feet down, her lantern caught the pale floor of the great chamber and the glowing amber of the flowstone curtain. She had done it. She had made a door. She climbed out into the bitter wind and sat on the ridgetop and wept once briefly the way she allowed herself nothing, and then she stopped and went to find the man who could help her use it. She had read his name many times, in the scientific journal whose pages she had worn soft as cloth. There were articles by a Professor Wycliffe Vane, who taught natural science at a college in Lexington, and who had spent 30 years studying the limestone country of Kentucky, the caves, the springs, the strange dissolving landscape that the science called karst. He was, by every measure she could find, the one man in the state most likely to understand what she had found, and the one man whose word would carry weight against a man like Thorne. She wrote to him. She walked 6 miles through February snow to the settlement to post the letter, enduring the stares and the silence. And she walked 6 miles back, and she waited. It is important to understand what Professor Vane was and what he was not in the story that followed. He was not the hero of it. He never thought himself so. He was an old man with white hair and aching knees, and a lifetime's curiosity that had not yet run dry. And when Verity Aldous' letter reached him, a letter written in a small, precise hand, describing formations and temperatures and hydrology with a rigor that startled him, a letter that could not possibly have been written by the madwoman the rumors described, he did the only thing his nature would allow. He came to look. He came because she asked him to, and because what she described was worth the journey. And he spent the rest of his life insisting that he had done nothing in this matter but confirm what Verity Aldous already knew. He was the witness. She was the discoverer. He never once let anyone forget the difference, least of all himself. He arrived at Ashen Ridge in the first week of March, an angular old man on a tired horse, with a student assistant and a mule loaded down with surveying instruments. Verity met him at the shaft, and she did not waste his time or hers with ceremony. She showed him the ladder she had built, black locust, the hardest and most rot-resistant wood in the hills round, rungs mortised into the side rails, and pegged with oak descending the full 25 feet of the shaft, to land near the base of the flowstone curtain. She lit a lantern, and she took Professor Wycliffe Vane down into the cathedral. He stood on the chamber floor for a long time without speaking. The student assistant said something, and the old man did not hear him. Vane turned slowly in the circle of lantern light, his face tilted up toward the columns that rose into the dark, toward the great curtain of flowstone glowing amber from within, toward the stalactites, hanging like the rafters of a church built before there were churches or men to build them. And when he finally spoke, his voice had gone thin and unsteady. The voice of a man who has studied the earth for 30 years and has just been reminded that the earth is far larger than his study of it. "I have seen a great many caves, Miss Aldous," he said. "I have not seen this." He stayed 4 days. He measured the cathedral with a surveyor's chain and a clinometer and found it to be 90-odd feet long and 78 wide and 44 feet from floor to ceiling at its highest reach. He cataloged the formations with the systematic patience of a man who had spent his life classifying the wonders of the ground. He tested the water of the still pool in the second chamber and found it pure, naturally filtered through the limestone, fit to drink without treatment. He measured the temperature at a dozen points and confirmed what she had recorded, a remarkable, unwavering constancy between 55 and 58 degrees, no matter the depth, no matter the season raging on the surface above. And he read her notebooks, all of them. He sat in the cathedral by lantern light and turned the pages of her small, precise hand. And what he found there changed the way he looked at her, because the notebooks were not the ravings the valley imagined. They were a survey, a careful, rigorous, beautiful survey, the work of a self-taught mind that had taught itself to look more honestly than most trained minds ever managed. "Where did you study?" he asked her when he had finished. "I didn't," she said. "I read Lyle. I read your journal. They taught me what I was looking at. They could not teach me to look. I had to learn that myself because there was no one to do it for me. The old man was quiet a while. The lantern light moved on the flowstone. "Miss Aldous," he said at last, "do you understand what you have here?" "I understand exactly what I have," she said. "What I do not yet understand is how to keep it. There is a man named Silas Thorne. His father is the one whose bones I found on the floor of this room. He believes this ridge is owed to him, and he means to have it, and he does not mean to see it for what it is. He means to break it up and sell it by the wagon load. I did not write to you for praise, Professor. I wrote to you because your word is worth something in this state, and mine is worth nothing. And I need the cave to be known and valued and protected before he finds a way to take it." It was the most she had said to anyone in months. And having said it, she felt the size of what she was up against settle on her like the weight of the stone in the crack. Professor Vane set down the notebook. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that had moved past respect into something more like resolve. "Then we had better make it known," he said. What followed should have been the turning of the tide, and for a few weeks it seemed to be. Vane was true to his word, and more. He wrote to colleagues. He returned to Ashen Ridge in April with 2 other scientists from the college and a newspaper man named Whitfield, who had written of the great caves at Mammoth and considered himself a hard man to impress. They descended the locust ladder into the cathedral, and Whitfield stood on the floor of the great chamber and turned slowly in the lantern light and said nothing at all for the better part of 5 minutes. And when he finally spoke, he asked Verity how long the formations had taken to grow. "Tens of thousands of years," she told him. "Perhaps 100,000 for the largest columns. A stalactite grows roughly an inch in a century when the water and the stone agree." He looked up at a stalactite that hung 6 feet down out of the dark. 600 years, he said. "At the very least," she said. "Likely more. And it has been here all that time, behind a crack in a rock that everyone walked past." Whitfield's article appeared in the Lexington paper in the last week of April, and it described Aldous's Cathedral Cave, for that was the name that stuck, though. Verity had never asked for her name to be on it in terms the restrained journalism of the day rarely allowed itself. It spoke of the discoverer, too. A woman. A self-taught naturalist living alone on a barren ridge who had crawled through a crack no wider than her shoulders to find a wonder the equal of any in the state. The article brought letters. The letters brought the curious. And for a brief season, Verity Aldous allowed herself to believe that her plan was working, that she had made the cave too known to be quietly destroyed. She had underestimated Silas Thorne. She had been thinking of him as a man who wanted stone. He was a man who wanted the answer to a 20-year-old question, and he had buried his patience so deep that even she, who read people as well as rock, had not seen how far he was willing to go. Vane offered to bring the survey before the proper authorities to begin the slow work of having the cave recognized for its scientific worth, the only kind of protection that might hold against a man with money. He explained an exact survey of the cave's full extent, and most particularly its boundaries. Because a cave does not respect the lines men draw on the surface, a chamber underground may lie beneath one man's land while its entrance opens onto another's, and the law in such cases was a tangle that turned on precisely where beneath the soil the rock began and ended. Vane wanted to know exactly which parts of the cathedral and its passages lay beneath Verity's 40 acres, and which, if any, did not. So, in May, with the snow gone and the ridge green with new growth, the old professor and the self-taught daughter set out to survey the boundaries of the underground. They worked for a week running the chain through the chambers and along the passages, tying the cave's geography to the survey lines on the surface above, with a care that taxed even Vane's experience. And at the end of that week in the second chamber, with the still pure pool throwing back the lantern light. Professor Vane straightened up from his calculations with a stillness that made Verity set down her own lantern and come to look. "What is it?" she said. He did not answer at once. He checked his figures again. Then he looked up at her, and there was a great heaviness in his old face. "The cathedral," he said. "The great chamber. It does not lie wholly beneath your 40 acres, Miss Aldous." He turned the surveyor's map toward her and traced a line across it with a finger that was not quite steady. "The survey line between your parcel and your eldest brother, Calder. The home farm runs through the ridge here, and the cathedral chamber straddles it. The entrance, the crack, the shaft you dug the eastern half of the great room, those are yours beyond dispute. But the western half of the cathedral, the flowstone curtain, the base of the great columns, the most significant formations in the entire system." He let the map fall. "Those lie beneath Calder Aldous's land, not yours, his." The pool dripped in the silence. Verity stood very still. She understood it all at once, the way she understood everything completely and without comfort. The cave was not hers, not all of it. The heart of it, the part the world had come to see, the part that made it a wonder rather than a whole, lay beneath the land of the brother who had not looked at her on the day they divided the estate. And whoever controlled Calder's land controlled the legal claim to the most precious chamber in the cave. And Silas Thorne, who had already bought the south slope from Merrick, who surrounded her now on two sides, had only to buy one more parcel to hold the cathedral itself. He had only to buy the home farm. He had only to buy out Calder. She did not wait. She walked down off the ridge that same evening, across the creek, and up to the porch of the farmhouse that was no longer hers, and she found her eldest brother at his supper. And she told him plainly what she had found, and what it meant. And she asked him, she who had asked her brothers for nothing in her whole life, to promise that he would not sell. Calder Aldous heard her out. He was 46 and heavy and certain, and he had spent his life measuring the world in acres and bushels. And he listened to his strange sister speak of cathedrals and flowstone and 100,000 years with the particular patience a practical man reserves for things he does not believe. "A cave," he said when she had finished. "The most significant cave Professor Vane has seen in 30 years. Worth more than the whole of the home farm, Calder. If it's kept whole, people will pay to see it. Scientists will come from across the country. It can support all of us for the rest of our lives if you will only—" "Silas Thorne," Calder said slowly, "came to see me 3 days ago. Offered me near twice what the home farm is worth on the open market. Cash on the table this season." He turned his cup in his thick hands. "I thought it was a fool's offer. Couldn't reckon why a man would pay double for tired bottomland." He looked up at her, and for the first time in her life, she saw something move behind her eldest brother's eyes that might have been the beginning of understanding, and might only have been greed waking up. "Now I reckon I know why." "Calder, please do not sell to him. You're asking me to turn down twice the worth of my land," Calder said, "on the strength of my runt sister telling me there's gold in a hole in the ground. The same sister the whole county says has gone mad. The same sister living in a crack in the rock." He shook his head slow and heavy. "Pa left me the home farm to do with as I see fit. What I do with it is my concern. You ought to know how that goes. You said near the same to me yourself the day he died." She had. She had stood at that very door and told Calder that what she did with her rock was her concern and no one else's. And now the words came back to her, turned around, used against her, and she had no answer for them because they were true. "How long," she said, "how long does he give you to decide?" "Till the fall," Calder said. "He's a patient man, Thorne. Says he'll wait on my answer till the harvest is in. He set down the cup. I haven't decided, Verity. I want you to know that. I haven't said yes to him. But I'm not going to say no to twice my land's worth on account of a story I can't see with my own eyes. He looked at her and his voice softened a single degree, which from Calder was a great deal. You want me to keep my land? Then show me. Show me this thing's worth what you say it is. Because right now all I've got is a rich man's cash in one hand and my sister's word in the other. And you have to understand how that weighs. She had until the fall. She had until the harvest was in to prove the cave was worth more whole than Thorne's money was worth in hand, to a brother who had never in his life valued anything he could not stack in a barn. And Silas Thorne had until the fall to do whatever a patient and ruthless man does when patience is no longer enough. She did not have to wait long to find out which way he would go. Through the summer of 1850, the visitors came, and Verity guided them, and the cave's name grew. She charged 25 cents for a tour by lantern light, and she limited her groups to 6, to protect the formations and to keep the soda straws from a careless elbow. She was not a showman. She told the truth about the stone, and the truth was more astonishing than any showman's patter. And people climbed back up the locust ladder into the daylight, with the particular silence of those who have been shown something they will not be able to explain to anyone who was not there. The income was modest, a few dollars a week, but it was steady, and it was more than she had ever earned. And every visitor was a witness, and every witness was a stone in the wall she was building between the cave and the man who wanted it. It was in that summer that the second person who would matter most in her life came up the ridge, not to take anything for once, but to look. Her name was Adeline Frost, and Professor Vane had sent her. She was 29, the daughter of a Lexington schoolteacher who had died the year before and left her a small inheritance, no family, and a gift for the illustration of plants that was extraordinary in its precision and entirely without the support of any institution that might have honored it. She drew the way, Verity observed, with a meticulous, almost devotional attention that turned the ordinary into the remarkable. Vane had mentioned in passing that the mouth of the cave held unusual growth ferns and mosses that thrived in the constant humidity of the crack's exhalation. And Adeline Frost had asked with the directness of a woman who had stopped expecting permission whether she might come and draw them. She arrived in June with a portfolio of botanical illustrations, a set of pencils and a magnifying glass worn on a cord around her neck like a pendant. She was tall, with auburn hair pulled back into a practical knot, and fingertips stained with ink she did not trouble to hide. She was not interested in the cave's grandeur, which set her apart at once from every other visitor. She was interested in its edges, the transition where the underground met the surface where the light failed, and the dark began where plants had learned to live in conditions no garden could imitate. She spent hours at the mouth of the crack, sketching the maidenhair ferns and the walking ferns, and a small green liverwort she could not name a species that would turn out, when Vane examined her drawings of it, to be unknown to science, a new living thing found growing at the entrance to a cave that no human being had entered until the previous November. Verity watched her work. She watched the way the pencil moved, quick and certain, laying down lines that caught not just the shape of a frond, but its character, the way it held the light, the way it curled at its tip, the way it lived against the stone. She watched the way Adeline Frost looked at things with the same refusal to glance once and move on the same conviction that the world gave itself only to those who were willing to stay and look again. You see things, Verity said to her on the second evening as they sat at the mouth of the crack, watching the sun go down behind the far ridges. Everyone sees things, Adeline said. She did not look up from her sketch. Everyone looks, Verity said. Not everyone sees. At that, Adeline did look up. Her eyes were the color of the pool in the cave's second chamber, dark clear with a depth that asked to be studied. She held Verity's gaze a moment longer than a stranger's gaze is held. "My father used to say nearly that," she said. "He said seeing was the hardest work there is, harder than digging, harder than building, because when you truly see a thing you have to accept what's there, not what you hoped would be there." "And what did you hope to find here?" Verity asked. "Ferns," Adeline said. The corner of her mouth moved. "I found a new species, a cave the equal of any in the country, and a woman who lives inside a mountain and is fighting a rich man for the right to keep it." She returned to her sketch, but the smile stayed. "I would say the reality has exceeded my expectations." Something settled in Verity Aldous's chest that evening that she did not have a word for and did not try to find one. She had been alone her whole life, peripheral in her father's house, shunned in the valley, solitary on the ridge by necessity and by the shape of her own strange nature. She had made a kind of peace with it, the way a person makes peace with the cold. And now here was someone who looked at the world the way she did, and who looked at her without flinching, and the loneliness she had carried so long that she had stopped feeling its weight, shifted just slightly, and let in a little light. Adeline Frost did not leave at the end of the week. She wrote to no one to explain it, and no one asked her to. She stayed to draw the ferns, and then she stayed to draw the formations descending the ladder into the cathedral, and spending whole days adjusting her lantern again and again to catch the exact quality of light on the flowstone. And somewhere in those days of shared silence and shared looking, the two of them became something the valley would never have a charitable name for, and that neither of them felt the slightest need to explain. They worked side by side. They built a life in the warmth of the deep earth. And for a few weeks, with the visitors coming and the drawings filling and the cave's name spreading, it was almost possible to forget Silas Thorne and the line that ran beneath the cathedral, and the harvest that was coming on. But the harvest came on regardless, and as the corn ripened in the valley below, Silas Thorne grew tired of waiting. He had a man working the south slope by then, the limestone ground he had bought from Merrick, the parcel just below and east of Verity's Ridge. A blasting crew ostensibly clearing rock and prospecting the seam, working with black powder along the shared boundary. Verity had heard the dull thump of their charges through the stone for weeks, a distant subterranean cough that traveled through the rock and into the cave and made the soda straws tremble in the third chamber. She had complained to no one because there was no one to complain to who would take the word of a strange woman over the lawful work of a paying landowner on his own ground. She would understand later that Thorne had known exactly what he was doing, that a patient man whose patience has finally run out does not need to break the law if he can arrange for an accident, that a blasting crew working a little too close to a boundary, a charge set a little too large a section of unstable ridge that happens to give way. These are misfortunes, and misfortunes are nobody's fault. And a cave whose discoverer is dead and whose passages have collapsed is a cave that can be quietly bought from a grieving family and quarried at leisure. It happened on a morning in late August, and it happened while Verity was deep in the cave. She had gone down alone before dawn into the third chamber, the soda straw gallery, to remap a section she meant to show the visitors that day. Adeline was on the surface sketching at the cabin in the early light. The blasting crew on the south slope set their morning charge at 8:15, and whether by design or by the carelessness that a designing man relies upon, the charge was far too large, set far too close to the unstable boundary of the ridge, and the blast that should have loosened a face of building stone instead drove a great shock through the limestone of Ashen Ridge itself. Verity heard it as a single enormous sound that was less a sound than a blow, a concussion that struck the whole of the cave at once. The lantern flame snapped sideways. The soda straws shattered around her in a falling rain of broken calcite, centuries of patient growth destroyed in an instant. And then, the deeper sound came, the grinding, tearing groan of stone, shifting that had not shifted in 100,000 years. And from the passage behind her, the low crawl that connected the soda straw gallery back toward the cathedral, and the ladder and the air and the light came a roar of falling rock as a section of the ceiling let go. The lantern went out. The dark came down absolute, the dark of the deep earth that her eyes could find no bottom to. And Verity Aldous understood, lying flat against the floor of the third chamber, with the dust of the fallen passage settling over her and the last echoes of the collapse dying away into a silence more total than any she had ever known. That the way out was gone, that she was sealed in the deepest room of the cave behind a fall of stone. She could not move, that no one knew exactly where she was, and that the air in a sealed room, however constant its temperature, does not last forever. She was alone in the absolute dark, 40 feet and 100,000 years from the world, buried alive in the wonder her father had given her. And somewhere far above in the bright August morning, Silas Thorne was waiting to be told that his long patience was finally conveniently at an end. In the absolute dark, Verity Aldous did the only thing she had ever truly known how to do. She lay still and she breathed and she thought. Panic was a current. She had felt it once before in the throat of the crack at 14 inches, and she had learned there that panic in a tight place was a kind of death you chose for yourself, before the stone chose it for you. So she let the terror rise, and she counted her breaths against it. 10 slow breaths in the blackness, and on the 10th the fear did not leave her, but it stepped back far enough that she could think past it. She took inventory the way she took inventory of everything. She had no light. The lantern had gone out, and she could not find it in the dark. And even if she found it, she had spilled the oil in the fall. She had her knife. She had the clothes on her back, and the chill of the cave's constant breath against her skin, 56 degrees. Neither warm enough to comfort nor cold enough to kill quickly. She had the soda straw gallery around her, ruined, now 100 centuries of growth, shattered to powder by a single charge of black powder, set by a man she had refused to sell to. And she had the air. That was the thing. The air was the clock now, and she did not know how much of it the room held, or how tightly the fall had sealed her in. And she understood that everything depended on whether the cave was still breathing. She had spent the better part of a year learning that the cave breathed. The crack exhaled. The shaft drew. The whole system moved air through itself in answer to the pressure of the sky, and that movement was the difference between a tomb and a place a person could live. If the fall had sealed the third chamber completely, the air would go stale and she would sleep, and not wake. But if anywhere at all, the breath still moved, then there was a way the air came in, and where air could come in, a person small enough and patient enough and willing enough might one day go out. She wet her finger with her own mouth and held it up in the dark, turning slowly the way she had turned her open palm before the breathing crack on the first morning a year ago. And she felt it. Faint. So faint she could not be certain it was not her own hope deceiving her. But there, a coolness on the wet skin of one side of her finger. The barest current moving not from the collapsed passage that had sealed her in, but from the far end of the chamber, the unmapped end. The dead end she had dismissed months before as a place the cave simply stopped. The cave was still breathing, and it was breathing from the one direction she had never bothered to explore, because she had been certain there was nothing there. She crawled toward it on her hands and knees through the dark, and the broken calcite, feeling her way along the wall, following the thread of moving air, the way she had once followed the cold current of the crack. not trusting it, only obeying it because it was the single thing in that blackness that seemed to know a way to somewhere else. At the far wall where the chamber had seemed to end, she found that it did not end. Her searching hands found a low slot in the rock near the floor, a horizontal seam barely a foot high. Breathing cool air hidden behind a ledge that had kept it from her in every survey she had made because she had never thought to lie down and look beneath. It was smaller than the crack on the surface. It was smaller than anything she had ever forced her body through. And she had no light to see where it went, or whether it pinched shut 6 feet in, or whether it would simply hold her in its throat and let her die there in the perfect dark instead of in the open room. She went in anyway, because the open room was a slower grave, and because she was the narrow one, she had always been the narrow one. Her father had written it down, and her brothers had laughed at it. And she had crawled into a crack no wider than her shoulders once already, and come out into a cathedral. What followed she would never be able to fully describe, even to Adeline, even years later. It was crawling through the inside of the earth in total darkness, blind by touch, and by the thread of moving air alone for a distance she could not measure, and a time she could not count. The slot rose and fell. It narrowed until she breathed out to fit through, and then opened enough to let her lift her head. Water ran somewhere she could hear it now, a stream moving through the rock, and the air grew steadily cooler and fresher against her face, and she understood that she was following an underground river toward wherever it came up into the world. She tore her hands on stone she could not see. She lost all sense of direction. But the one that mattered, which was the direction the air was moving, and the air was moving toward freshness, toward openness, toward out. And then her reaching hand found not stone but space, and she pulled herself through a final low gap and felt the floor fall away into a great room, and she lay at the edge of it, gasping and far off. Impossibly, there was light, not lantern light, not firelight. Daylight, gray and distant and filtered through some opening she could not yet see, but daylight. And it fell into a chamber that, as her eyes drank it in after the absolute dark, revealed itself to be enormous, nearly the equal of the cathedral itself. A second great room, lower and longer, that no one had ever entered, fed by the underground stream that ran along its floor and out. She could see now through a low passage at the far end where the gray light came in, a way out, a natural opening to the surface somewhere down the valley at the bottom end of the ridge. She lay in the dim light and she wept briefly the way she allowed herself nothing. And then she stopped and she made herself look, because looking was the thing she was for. And what she saw as her eyes followed the stream toward the gray light was a second set of bones. Not Thorne's father. She had buried him. These lay near the underground stream where a man might have crawled, following water exactly as she had. And the rusted remains beside them were not a surveyor's chain, but the iron of a lantern and the buckle of a pack. And she understood, kneeling there in the half-light of the room. No one had known that she was looking at the rest of the story. Her father's letter had only begun to tell. Thorne's father had not died at the foot of the cathedral by accident. He had been trying to do exactly what she had just done, to find a second way through, a way around a way to map the whole of the ridge so he could claim it. He had gone the wrong direction. He had crawled into the dark following the wrong current, and the wrong current had brought him here to this room where he had run out of light and oil and finally hope, and had lain down by the water to rest, and the dark had kept him. There was an irony in it she was too exhausted to feel. She had found her way out by reading the cave correctly. He had died by reading it wrong. The difference between them in the end was the same difference her father had named in the deed, and the same difference Adeline had named at the mouth of the crack. He had come to take. She had come to see. And the cave gave itself only to the one who looked. She crawled toward the gray light, and the stream led her down through the low passage, and she came out at last into the open air at the bottom of the ridge, near where the creek ran through the valley. Blinking and filthy and bleeding and alive, into a late August afternoon she had been certain she would never see. She had been underground for nearly the whole of a day, and she stood in the daylight with the second great chamber at her back, and she understood three things at once, with the cold, clear completeness with which she understood everything. She was alive. The cave had a second entrance, a true entrance opening onto the valley floor. And that second chamber, that whole magnificent room, lay at the bottom end of the ridge, well within her own 40 acres, beyond any question, beyond any survey line on land that was hers, and only hers. The heart of the cave that mattered to the world might straddle Calder's boundary in the cathedral, but here was a chamber its equal, found by no one before her, opening onto her own land through her own ground, with the bones of Silas Thorne's father lying inside it, to prove who had truly mapped Ashen Ridge first. The boundary that had threatened to undo her did not matter anymore. She had crawled beneath it and come out the other side into the truth. She walked up the valley toward the ridgetop, and Adeline Frost, who had been clawing at the rubble of the collapsed crack with her bare hands, since the moment of the blast, who had screamed for help into the throat of the rock and gotten nothing back, who had been certain for the whole of that endless day that she had lost. The one person in the world who saw the way she saw, looked up from the fallen stone and saw Verity Aldous walking toward her out of the bottom of the ridge, alive. And the cry that came out of Adeline then was a sound Verity carried with her for the rest of her life. What happened next happened quickly. The way things happen when the truth is finally on your side. Verity did not go to the law first. She went to the press because she had learned the lesson the whole long winter had taught her, that a thing made known cannot be quietly taken. She sent for Whitfield, the newspaper man, and she sent for Professor Vane, and she brought them down through the new lower entrance into the second great chamber. And she showed them the bones by the stream, and she told them the whole of it. The blast, the crew working too close to the boundary, the charge far too large, the collapse that had nearly killed her, set off by a crew in the pay of Silas Thorne, a man who had been trying to buy or break the ridge for a year, and who would now conveniently find its discoverer dead and its passages ruined. Whitfield was a hard man, but he was an honest one, and he had stood in the cathedral once and felt what it was. He went to the south slope and he looked at the blasting crew's charge holes, and he talked to the men who were frightened now that there had nearly been a death, and who let slip more than Thorne would have wished about the size of the charge and the orders they had been given, about where to set it. And Whitfield wrote. He wrote about the cave and the woman who had discovered it, and very nearly died for it, and the man of rails and stone who had surrounded her land, and then when patience failed him, had blasted at her boundary until the ridge came down on her head. He did not have to accuse Thorne of murder. He only had to lay the facts side by side, and let the reader draw the line between them, and the readers of Kentucky drew it. There is a kind of man the public will forgive much, but the man who would crush a wonder of the natural world to sell it for ballast and bury a woman alive to do it was not that kind of man. The story traveled. It reached Lexington and Frankfort and beyond. And Silas Thorne, who had spent 20 years and a great deal of money waiting to learn what the ridge had taken from him, found that the answer had arrived at last in the worst possible form. Not as a deed in his hand, but as his own name in every paper in the state, attached to the near murder of a self-taught woman who lived inside a mountain. His backers withdrew. The rail interests that had funded his patient acquisition of the ridge wanted nothing to do with a scandal. and the limestone trade could buy its ballast anywhere. The blasting crew, fearing prosecution, told the county what they knew. Thorne was never charged. The law of Harlan County was not built to convict a man of his standing on the word of frightened laborers, but he was finished in the only way that mattered. He could not buy the ridge now. No one would sell to him under the eyes of the whole state, and no judge would hear his quiet talk of guardianship and unsound women. Now that the unsound woman was a celebrated discoverer, and he was the villain who had tried to bury her. He came up the ridge one last time in the fall, when the harvest was nearly in. He did not dismount. He looked at Verity standing at the mouth of the lower entrance, and the practiced warmth was long gone from his face, and what was left was only the old cold thing that had brought his father up the ridge before him. "You found him," Thorne said. "My father. Down there, didn't you?" "I found him," Verity said. "He died crawling the wrong way in the dark. He came to take the cave, and the cave kept him. I buried the bones I found at the cathedral. The ones by the stream are his too, I think. You can have them if you want them. I'll bring them up. They're the only thing in this ridge that was ever going to be yours." Silas Thorne looked at her for a long moment. The cave breathed warm into the cold autumn air between them, a faint plume rising from the rock, the breath of the thing that had now defeated 2 generations of men who came to take it. "My father spent his life measuring other men's land," he said at last, "so that one day he could own some of it himself. He died in a hole reaching for it." He gathered his reins. "I spent 20 years finishing what killed him, and a woman who reads rocks beat us both." He almost laughed. It was not a kind sound, but it was for the first time a true one. "Keep your cave, Miss Aldous. It was never going to give itself to the likes of us." He rode down off Ashen Ridge, and he did not come back. Verity brought the bones up from the lower chamber a few days later, and buried them beside the first stone, the blank one. And after some thought, she carved nothing on either grave but the dates, because the man who deserved a name had not earned one, and the man who might have earned one she had never known. She let them lie under the morning sun on the ridge top. 2 men who had come to take kept now by the same patient ground that had kept the cave safe for 100,000 years. And then there was Calder. She did not ask him again. She had asked once, and asking had cost her something she did not have much of to spare, and she had decided she would not ask twice. But she did not have to, because it was Thaddeus, the quiet brother, the one who had stood in the doorway on the day of the division, and said nothing, the one nearest to her in temperament, if never in warmth, who came up the ridge in the days after the story broke, and who told her the thing that changed how she held the whole of her life. Thaddeus had found it among their father's papers, a second document written in Obadiah Aldous's hand, and witnessed by no one, never filed, never meant for the law. A letter to be opened by the family after his death, that Thaddeus had taken when the estate was divided, and had kept, and had said nothing of, because he had not understood it, and had not known what it would do. In it their father explained what he had done and why. He explained that he had given the worthless ridge to Verity on purpose, that the phrase in the deed had been a key meant for her hand alone, that he had spent 30 years guarding a wonder beneath the family land, and had come at the end of his life to a single hard question: which of his children he could trust to keep it after he was gone. Not the eldest, who measured the world in bushels and would have sold it for the price of a mule. Not the second, who saw a forest and counted board feet. He had loved his sons, the letter said, but he had watched them and he knew them. And he knew that a thing of beauty placed in their hands would last exactly as long as it took someone to offer them money for it. He had seen what wanting did to a man. He had watched it kill the surveyor who came asking 20 years before, had sent the man off with a lie, and then learned to his horror that the man had gone up the ridge anyway and never come down. He had carried that death in silence the rest of his life, and he had resolved that the ridge would go to the one child of his who would never want the cave. The way the surveyor had wanted it, the way his sons would want it, but would only ever want to see it. The daughter, the strange one, the one who read the earth and asked the useless questions and noticed the things that paid no wage, the narrow one. I never knew how to say to your sister that I saw her the letter ended. It was not in me to say it. So I am writing it down instead and trusting the rock to carry it the way it carries water, slow in the dark for years, until it reaches the one place it was always going. Verity. You were the one I trusted. You were always the one. I am sorry it took my dying to tell you so. Thaddeus read it to her standing at the mouth of the cave, because he could not have gotten the words out looking at her, and when he had finished, he folded the letter and held it out, and his hand was shaking, and he said the only thing he had ever said to her that mattered. He was right about you, Thaddeus said. We were wrong. I was wrong that day on the porch to stand there and say nothing. I've been wrong about you my whole life. He pressed the letter into her hands. I told Calder what was in it. I told him to take his name off any paper Thorne ever put in front of him, and to keep the home farm in the family where Pa left it, and to do it for shame if he wouldn't do it for love. He almost smiled. He's a hard man, Calder, but he's not a man who likes to be on the wrong side of his own father. He won't sell. Not now. Not after this. And he did not. Calder Aldous never sold the home farm to anyone, and when, in time, the cave was given the protection of the law and recognized for what it was, the boundary that ran beneath the cathedral became a matter of family rather than of lawyers, and the whole of the cave, the eastern half beneath Verity's ridge and the western half beneath Calder's farm, and the great lower chamber that was hers beyond dispute, was held together by the family as one. The two of them were never close. That would have been too neat a thing for the truth, and the truth in families is rarely neat. But on a cold morning that fall, Calder climbed down the locust ladder into the cathedral, the first and only time he ever went into the cave, and he stood on the floor of the great chamber in the lantern light and looked up at the columns and the flowstone curtain glowing amber from within. And he was silent for a very long time, a heavy and certain man, finding late that the world was larger than the part of it he had learned to count. Pa knew, he said at last, the same words their father's letter had carried. All those years, he knew this was down here. He knew, Verity said, and he gave it to you. Calder shook his head slowly, and there was no greed left in it now. Only something that might in a man like him have been the beginning of all. Gave you the rock so you'd be the one to find it, while we laughed at you on the porch. He looked at her, and for the first and last time in their lives, her eldest brother looked at her directly, the way he had not looked at her on the day they divided the estate. He was a smarter man than I gave him credit for, and you were a better one than I gave you credit for too. It changed nothing about the past, but it changed the way she held the past, which was enough. The years after that accumulated the way the calcite had built the formations slowly, steadily, each one laying down its thin, patient layer over the one before. The cave's name grew, though it never became a mammoth or a luray. It remained known the way a thing of genuine worth becomes known in a region, through word of mouth and the slow accretion of respect. Scientists corresponded with her. The State Geological Survey cited her observations. Professor Vane brought his students year after year until he grew too old to make the journey, and he never once in all that time let anyone forget that he had been the witness and she the discoverer. and that the difference between those two things was the whole of the matter. Adeline Frost never left. She drew the cave for the rest of her life. The flowstone curtain, the soda straw gallery that Verity had patiently let regrow where the blast had broken it, the great lower chamber with its underground stream, the helictites curling against the stone. Her illustrations accumulated across the decades became the most complete visual record of any American cave of the century. Precise enough that a geologist could read the mineralogy from the drawing alone, luminous enough that a person who had never gone underground could feel the weight of the dark and the age. The two of them built a home in the warmth of the deep earth in the alcove near the flowstone curtain, with a sleeping platform raised off the floor, and shelves wedged into the natural irregularities of the wall, and a life of looking side by side that the valley never had a kind name for, and that the two of them never once felt the need to defend. There were children in time taken in and raised as their own. A boy they called Obadiah, after the father who had seen Verity when no one else would, and a girl, Linnea, who had no one's name but her own. The children grew up between two worlds, the windy cedar-scented ridgetop above and the silent, constant cave below. And the cave was the most extraordinary playground any children ever had. The boy was cautious and exact, and learned to name every formation and explain how each had grown. The girl was fearless and physical, drawn to the cave's unexplored edges, and it was Linnea who, at 12 years old, crawling through a passage Verity had marked as a dead end, found on the far side a chamber Verity herself had never reached, proving as if it needed proving that the cave was not finished, giving itself and never would be, and that the looking would go on after the looker was gone. The war came, and unlike the weather above the ridge, it did not pass quickly. Kentucky's divided heart brought soldiers of both kinds through the valley below the gap, and in the worst of those years the cave became something close to a sanctuary, a place outside the conflict, outside time, where the only war was the slow, patient war of water against stone, and the only casualties were the centuries it took a stalactite to grow another inch. They moved their stores underground where the constant cool kept food better than any cabin, and where foraging parties of either army never thought to look. And that practice fed the family through a winter when every farm in the valley was stripped bare. Verity guided whoever came, soldiers on leave, deserters, frightened men of every loyalty who wanted nothing more than to stand for an hour in a beautiful room and forget what the world above was doing to itself. She charged them nothing. It seemed wrong to profit from beauty while young men were dying in fields not 50 miles off. The brothers grew old and died as brothers do. Merrick, first killed at the sawmill by the very timber that was his living. Calder, some years after his hard heart simply stopping in a field he had plowed every spring for 30 years. They had not become close to her, any of them, but the breach had healed enough that she stood at both their graves and grieved them honestly, which was more than she would have once believed possible. Thaddeus, the quiet brother who had carried their father's letter and chosen finally to set it free, lived longest of the three and came up to the cave often in his last years, and would sit with her in the cathedral by lantern light, and say very little, and the silence between them by then was not the silence of the porch, but a different kind. An easy one, the silence of two people who have come at last to understand each other. Adeline died in the spring of 1888 of pneumonia in the cathedral chamber, where they had lived for nearly 40 years. The formations above her, the stalactites, the columns, the great flowstone curtain that had glowed amber on the night Verity first crawled in alone, had witnessed her coming as a young woman, with ink-stained fingers and a magnifying glass on a cord. And they witnessed her going with the same ancient, patient indifference with which they witnessed everything. Verity sat beside her as the lantern burned low, and held her hand, which was stained with ink to the very last. and the drip in the second chamber kept its rhythm, and somewhere, in the deeper passages, the air moved through the stone with a sound like slow breathing. She buried Adeline on the ridgetop in a place where the morning sun fell first, and where in spring the maidenhair fern she had come all that way to study grew so thick the rocky ground looked softened, almost gentle. She carved her name into a slab of the ridge's own limestone, and beneath the name she carved the words Adeline had said to her on the second evening they ever sat together, at the mouth of the crack, the words that had been true of the whole of the life that followed. Reality exceeded expectations. Verity Aldous lived 1 year more. She spent most of it in the cave in the amber light of the flowstone curtain, writing the last of her observations into the last of 39 notebooks that spanned 40 years. She wrote about the cave's constancy, the same temperature, the same formations, the same slow drip in the second chamber that had been falling. She calculated for at least 50,000 years, and would fall for 50,000 more. She wrote about what it meant to live inside the earth, to be sheltered by stone, to measure your one small life against a scale that made it invisible. The understanding did not make her feel small. It made her feel held, cradled in something so much larger and so much more patient than herself, that her old griefs and her old loneliness became, if not nothing, then at least proportional, a single layer of calcite among uncounted thousands. And she wrote near the end about the crack in the east face of Ashen Ridge that had been too narrow for her brothers, too dark for her neighbors, too strange for the men who came to take. The crack that her father had crawled into 30 years before she did, and had kept secret, and had at last entrusted to the one child narrow enough to follow him through. She wrote that the earth keeps its wonders in tight places, that it always has, that the question had never been what lay beyond the crack. The question had only ever been who would be narrow enough and brave enough to turn sideways and find out. She died on a January morning in 1890, 78 years old, in the cathedral chamber, with a lantern burning and her notebook open, and the cave breathing around her in its slow, eternal rhythm. The boy Obadiah Groan now found her in the morning. He recorded the temperature the way she had taught him, the way she had recorded it every day of her life in that place. 56 degrees. He closed her notebook and set it on the shelf beside the others, 39 of them, 40 years of looking. Then he climbed the locust ladder into the January cold and stood on the ridgetop among the graves and looked at the mountains, which were white with snow and very still. The cave continued. It always had. It always would. The notebooks went to the college at Lexington, where they became a foundation of the study of the limestone country, and a geologist would write of them. Long after that, they were among the most detailed and accurate amateur cave surveys of the century. Remarkable, he said, not only for their precision, but for the evident affection with which their author had regarded her subject. Adeline's illustrations went to the Great Museum in Washington, where a selection of them hangs to this day. The cave itself in time was given the protection of the law, and the name of a national landmark, and modern instruments confirmed what Verity Aldous had measured by pacing and estimation, and the patient turning of a brass compass that the temperature held between 55 and 58 degrees the year round, exactly as she had recorded, and that the formations were calcite and aragonite and gypsum, exactly as she had named them, and that the water of the pure pool followed the path she had traced. The flowstone curtain is still intact. The soda straws hang again in their crystalline forest, regrown across the decades since the blast. Slow and patient, an inch in a century, the pure pool still holds its clear, still water, fed by a drip that has not stopped since before there were people anywhere on the continent, and the crack in the east face of Ashen Ridge is still there. It is still 18 inches wide. On cold days you can see the breath of it, a faint plume of warm air rising from the rock, like the exhalation of something asleep. Most people walk past it the way people always have. It is too narrow. It is too dark. It is too much like a mouth. But the cathedral is still on the other side of it, 40 feet in and a world away, waiting as it has always waited for someone willing to turn sideways and see what the darkness holds. The earth keeps its wonders in tight places. It always has. The question was never what lay beyond the crack. The question was always who would be narrow enough and brave enough to find out. A man named Obadiah Aldous knew the answer 30 years before anyone thought to ask it. He had a daughter, and she was the narrow one. She always was.